Old Leo pushed his mop across the gleaming floors of the NASA Control Center. A ghost in the machine of geniuses, never knowing that the simple observation he was about to make would save the most advanced rocket in history from the very men who had built it. Men who saw a janitor, and not the brilliant mind they so desperately needed. His world was one of ammonia and echoing footsteps. A universe contained within the lonely hours after midnight when the titans of intellect had gone home, leaving behind only the ghosts of their calculations on whiteboards and the faint scent of burnt coffee. He was invisible. A relic of a bygone era in a place that only ever looked forward. Yet, he was about to become the linchpin for their future. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Leo traced the familiar path around the central command console. His movements, a slow, practiced ballet of efficiency. The building was his silent partner, a colossal entity of glass and steel that hummed with a constant, low-grade energy. Tonight, however, there was a different hum, a subtle dissonance that pricked at the edges of his perception. It was a vibration, a faint tremor that traveled up the handle of his mop and into the bones of his hands. He paused, head cocked, listening not with his ears but with his entire body, a skill honed over 73 years of quiet observation. The engineers, in their world of data streams and spectral analysis, had measured it, of course. They called it anomaly 7-3 alpha, a ghost in their machine that they couldn't exorcise. They had thrown teams of their brightest minds at it, running simulations on supercomputers that could map the cosmos. Yet, the phantom vibration persisted, a tiny, insistent flaw in their perfect creation. Leo felt it not as a data point, but as a symptom of a deeper illness, a wrong note in a symphony he understood better than anyone. He looked through the reinforced observation window at the Ares 7. A gleaming white spear aimed at the heavens, bathed in the stark luminescence of a dozen floodlights. To the world, it was a symbol of progress, of humanity's unyielding reach for the stars. To Leo, at this moment, it was a magnificent bell with a fatal crack, and only he could hear the discordant toll that signaled its impending doom. He felt a familiar ache in his chest, the weight of knowledge that no one would ask for, the burden of a voice that had long been forgotten. He knew he had to try and say something, a decision that would set him on a collision course with the very world that had deemed him insignificant. Dr. Aris Thorne stared at the holographic display, his face a mask of controlled frustration. The data was unequivocal, a cascade of numbers and graphs that all screamed the same infuriating message: failure. The micro-vibration in the primary liquid fuel conduit of the Ares 7 was not just persistent, it was, under simulated maximum thrust, growing. It was an infinitesimal shudder, a tremor so small it was barely measurable. Yet at 25,000 miles per hour, the infinitesimal could become catastrophic. The launch was in 3 weeks. The entire world was watching. His career, the legacy of this program, the very future of American space exploration, all rested on solving this riddle. He and his team had disassembled and reassembled the engine assembly 3 times. They had rewritten the fuel flow algorithms, recalculated the resonant frequencies of every single component, and consulted with the finest minds in material science. Yet, the anomaly remained, a stubborn, mocking flaw in their multi-billion-dollar masterpiece. Aris ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the gesture sharp with a current of contained panic. He was a man who believed in data, in the clean, empirical truth of numbers. He had built his reputation on a foundation of unassailable logic. But this problem felt different. It felt less like an engineering challenge and more like a curse, a malicious gremlin tucked away deep inside the rocket's metallic heart. Every potential solution led to a dead end. Every theory collapsed under the weight of testing. The pressure was immense, a physical weight that settled on his shoulders, tightening its grip with every passing hour. He felt the eyes of his team on him, looking for the certainty and command that had always been his hallmark, but finding only a growing, gnawing doubt. He dismissed them for the night with a wave of his hand, the forced confidence in his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. He needed to be alone with the problem, to wrestle with it without the pretense of leadership. He was Dr. Aris Thorne, the man who could solve the unsolvable, but as he looked at the waterfall of red flag data, for the first time in his professional life, he was beginning to believe he had finally met his match. A foe that logic alone could not defeat. The silence of the control room was absolute, broken only by the quiet hum of the servers, a sound that usually comforted him but now felt like the ticking of a clock counting down to his inevitable failure. Leo finished his rounds in the main control room, the scent of his cleaning solution, a stark contrast to the sterile, electric air of the place. He was buffing the floor to a mirror shine when he saw it. A set of rolled-up schematics left on a side table, held down by a half-empty coffee mug. It was a breach of protocol, of course. These documents were sensitive, meant to be locked away at the end of the day. But exhaustion and frustration had made the engineers careless. Leo felt a pull, an old, familiar curiosity that he had spent decades trying to suppress. He glanced around the empty room, his heart giving a small, traitorous flutter. For a moment, he was not a janitor. He was who he used to be. With a trembling hand, weathered and gnarled from years of physical labor, he gently lifted the mug and unrolled the heavy paper. It was a cross-section of the Ares 7's primary engine cluster, a dizzyingly complex illustration of pipes, valves, and combustion chambers. His eyes, clouded by age but still sharp, scanned the intricate lines not as a layman would, but with the focused, analytical gaze of an expert. He saw not just a drawing, but a dynamic system, a dance of forces and pressures he understood intimately. And then he saw it. It wasn't a mistake, not an error in calculation that a computer would flag. It was a design choice. A small, almost insignificant detail in the placement of a tertiary support strut for the main fuel line. On paper, it was perfect. The load distribution was balanced, the material stress well within acceptable limits. But Leo saw what the simulators, with all their processing power, could not. He saw the vibration not as a single, isolated event, but as a part of a larger, hidden symphony. He could see how the rhythmic pulse of the fuel pumps, a low-frequency hum, would travel along the conduit and hit that specific strut. The strut, by its precise angle and placement, would not dampen the vibration, but amplify it, turning a harmless shudder into a resonant cascade, a feedback loop of ever-increasing energy that would, eventually, shake the conduit to pieces. It was a simple, elegant, and catastrophic oversight. He knew he had to tell someone. He felt a cold dread mix with a strange, forgotten sense of purpose. He carefully rolled the schematic back up, placed the mug precisely where he had found it, and walked towards the junior engineer's office, his worn-out work boots squeaking softly on the floor he had just polished, each step feeling heavier than the last. He was about to cross a line, to shatter the silent, unspoken contract of his invisibility. He found a young engineer named David still at his desk, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his monitor. A picture of exhausted concentration. Leo cleared his throat softly, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet office. David looked up, his eyes taking a moment to adjust, to register the old man in the gray uniform. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite, but tinged with the weary impatience of someone interrupted deep in thought. "It's the strut," Leo said, his voice raspy from disuse. "The tertiary support on the primary fuel line. It's angled wrong." David blinked, a slow, uncomprehending expression on his face. He looked Leo up and down, taking in the faded uniform, the mop and bucket just outside the door. "I'm sorry," he said, a hint of patronizing confusion in his voice. "What are you talking about?" Leo took a step closer, pointing a crooked finger towards the monitor, which displayed a complex rendering of the engine. "There," he said, his finger hovering over the exact point on the screen. "The vibration isn't being dampened. It's creating a harmonic resonance. The angle, it acts like a tuning fork. You need to change the angle by 7 degrees and add an asymmetrical brace." David stared at the old man, a bemused smile starting to form on his lips. He thought it was a joke, or perhaps the ramblings of a lonely old man who had spent too much time around advanced technology. "Sir," he said, the word dripping with condescension, "I appreciate the input, but we have some of the most advanced diagnostic systems in the world. I think we have it covered. You should probably get back to your work." The dismissal was gentle, but it stung Leo like a physical blow. He saw the wall go up in the young man's eyes, the quiet judgment, the complete inability to see past the uniform. "The simulators can't see it," Leo insisted, his voice gaining a quiet urgency. "They see it as a static structure. But it's not. It's dynamic. It's about the flow, the rhythm. You're looking at the math, but you're not listening to the music." David's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "The music? Look, I'm very busy. We're dealing with a very complex problem here." He turned back to his screen, a clear and final dismissal. Leo stood there for a long moment, the ghost of his former self receding, leaving only the old janitor in its place. He had tried. He turned and walked away, the squeak of his boots a lonely, retreating sound in the long, silent hallway. He had offered the key, and the man with the lock had simply refused to take it. The following week was a slow, agonizing descent into desperation for the Ares 7 team. The problem of the vibration, once a frustrating anomaly, had now become a full-blown crisis. A new series of high-fidelity simulations, pushed to the absolute limits of the system's parameters, yielded catastrophic results. In 7 out of 10 virtual launches, the primary fuel conduit ruptured just as the rocket reached max Q, the point of maximum aerodynamic stress. The holographic displays, once a source of pride, now played out a silent, repeating horror show of digital fire and debris. The control room, usually a hive of focused energy and intellectual camaraderie, became a tomb of grim faces and whispered, anxious conversations. Dr. Aris Thorne seemed to age a decade in a matter of days. He barely slept, fueled by an increasingly volatile mixture of caffeine and sheer willpower. He drove his team relentlessly, his usual calm and methodical leadership replaced by a brittle, sharp-edged intensity. They tried everything. They proposed radical, high-risk solutions, from installing bulky, heavy, active dampeners that would compromise the rocket's payload capacity, to rewriting the entire launch sequence to try and outrun the resonant frequency. Each new idea was a flurry of frantic activity, a temporary surge of hope that was inevitably crushed by the unforgiving logic of the next simulation. The mood soured. Arguments broke out between teams, fingers were pointed, and the once unshakable confidence of the world's most brilliant engineers began to crack, revealing the raw fear and professional insecurity beneath. Aris felt the project, his life's work, slipping through his fingers like fine sand. The calls from Washington were becoming more frequent, the questions sharper, the undertone of political impatience more pronounced. He was a man adrift on a sea of insoluble data, and the shoreline of a solution was nowhere in sight. Through it all, Leo continued his nightly rounds, a silent observer to the unfolding chaos. He saw the mounting stress on the young engineers' faces, the growing pile of discarded coffee cups, the slumped shoulders of men and women who were accustomed to victory but were now staring into the abyss of defeat. He cleaned their workspaces, emptied their trash cans filled with crumpled calculations, and felt the weight of their failure as if it were his own. He knew the answer was still there, simple and waiting. But the chasm between his world and theirs seemed wider and more impassable than ever. Leo lived in a small, meticulously clean apartment 20 miles from the launch facility. The rooms were filled not with personal trinkets or family photos, but with books. Stacks of them covered every available surface, their subjects ranging from theoretical physics to materials, science, and fluid dynamics. They were old, many of them with faded, cracked spines, their pages filled with his own spidery, handwritten notes in a language most of his colleagues at NASA wouldn't recognize. On a small, sturdy shelf in his living room sat a single, framed photograph. It wasn't of a wife or a child, but of a younger Leo, standing proudly with a group of smiling men and women in front of a university building, its architecture distinctly Eastern European. In the photo, he wore a tailored suit, not a janitor's uniform, and he held a diploma, his face bright with the fierce intelligence and boundless optimism of a young man at the pinnacle of his academic career. This was Professor Leopold Vassal, once the head of the mechanical engineering department at a prestigious university that had been erased from the map by the cruelties of war and shifting borders. He had been a leading mind in the field of harmonic resonance, a pioneer whose groundbreaking papers were still cited by academics who had no idea their author was now scrubbing floors for a living. When his country collapsed, he had lost everything: his home, his colleagues, his reputation, his life's work. He had arrived in America as a refugee with nothing but the clothes on his back and the vast, unshakable knowledge stored in his mind. But his degrees were from a place that no longer existed. His references were scattered or gone, and his thick accent and quiet, old-world dignity were mistaken for a lack of education. The only work he could find was manual labor. And so Professor Vassal became Leo, the janitor, trading lecture halls for hallways and differential equations for cleaning solutions. He never spoke of his past. To what end? It was a ghost, a life that belonged to another man in another world. Yet, late at night, in the quiet solitude of his apartment, he would take down his old textbooks, his fingers tracing the familiar equations, the feel of the paper, a comfort, a reminder of who he truly was. He wasn't bitter. He had found a quiet peace in his simple, invisible life. But the problem with the Ares 7 had stirred something in him, a dormant piece of his old self that yearned for the elegant thrill of solving the impossible. He looked at the photograph, at the hopeful face of the young professor, and felt a profound sense of duty, not just to the mission, but to the man he had been. The pressure on Aris Thorne had reached a breaking point. In a last-ditch effort, his team had implemented a software patch designed to modulate the fuel pumps, hoping to create a counter-frequency that would cancel out the vibration. It was a desperate Hail Mary pass, and it failed more spectacularly than any of them could have imagined. During a full-power ground test, the software fix, instead of dampening the resonance, amplified it exponentially. For 30 terrifying seconds, the entire launch tower shook with a violent bone-jarring shudder. Alarms blared across the facility as the main fuel conduit began to buckle, its internal sensors screaming warnings of imminent structural collapse. An emergency shutdown was triggered just in time, the engines cutting off with a sickening lurch that left an eerie, ringing silence in its wake. The test was a disaster. The conduit was damaged, pushing the launch schedule back by weeks, if not months. The project's budget, already strained, was now facing millions in repair costs. More importantly, the confidence in Thorne's leadership was shattered. That afternoon, he was summoned to a video conference with a panel of grim-faced administrators from Washington. The questions were no longer about finding a solution, they were about assigning blame. Thorne stood alone in the conference room, enduring a quiet, brutal evisceration of his team's performance, his own decisions questioned at every turn. He felt the legacy he had spent a lifetime building crumble into dust. When the call ended, he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the blank screen, the silence of the room a testament to his utter and complete failure. It was in this moment of absolute defeat that Leo chose to make his second attempt. He had seen the terror on the engineers' faces during the test, had felt the violent shaking of the very ground beneath his feet. He knew he could not stay silent any longer. He found Thorne in the empty conference room, a solitary figure adrift in a sea of polished mahogany. "Dr. Thorne," Leo began, his voice quiet but firm. Aris looked up, his eyes hollow, seeing not a janitor but just another specter in his personal nightmare. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I can fix it," Leo said simply. A spark of bitter, incredulous anger ignited in Thorne's exhausted mind. He let out a short, sharp, and utterly mirthless laugh. The sound of Thorne's laugh was brittle and sharp, echoing in the cavernous conference room. It wasn't a laugh of amusement, but of pure, unadulterated contempt. The last resort of a man whose world had collapsed. "You can fix it?" he repeated, his voice dripping with a sarcasm so thick it was almost a physical presence. He slowly turned his head to look at Leo, a gesture of profound weariness. "You? The janitor? What are you going to do? Mop the vibration away?" A few of Thorne's senior engineers, who had been hovering near the doorway, overheard the exchange and moved closer, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "Let me guess," one of them chimed in, a cruel smirk on his face. "You've got a theory about the music of the engine, right?" The group shared a chuckle, the sound harsh and alien in the tense atmosphere. For them, it was a moment of gallows humor, a brief, bitter release from the crushing pressure they were all under. They saw an old, simple-minded man who had picked the worst possible moment to offer his nonsensical, homespun wisdom. They didn't see the lifetime of expertise standing before them, hidden behind a faded uniform and wrinkled skin. Thorne stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked towards Leo, his steps heavy with the weight of his failure. He was not a cruel man by nature, but humiliation and stress had curdled his professionalism into a raw, defensive anger. He needed, to lash out at a target that couldn't fight back. "Stick to your job," Thorne said, his voice low and menacing. "I am responsible for the most advanced piece of aerospace engineering in human history. I am surrounded by people with doctorates from the finest institutions on the planet. I do not need advice from the man who cleans the toilets." The words hung in the air, each one a calculated strike designed to humiliate, to put Leo back in the box they had built for him. Leo's face remained impassive, but inside, a profound sadness settled over him. It wasn't anger he felt, but a deep, weary pity for these brilliant, blind men. He had seen this same intellectual arrogance before, in the halls of his old university, among colleagues who believed their degrees made them infallible. He simply nodded, a gesture of quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate Thorne even more. Leo turned without another word and walked away, the sound of their stifled laughter following him down the hall like a physical shadow. He had offered them a lifeline, and they had not only refused it, they had mocked him for it. That night, Leo didn't go home after his shift. He went instead to the small, dusty workshop behind the main hangar, a place for minor repairs and forgotten equipment. There, using discarded scraps of metal and a few basic tools, he began to build something. It was a small, rudimentary model, a physical representation of his solution. He fashioned a simple pipe to represent the fuel conduit, and attached a small, weighted arm to a makeshift strut, angled at precisely the position he had identified on the schematics. He worked for hours, his gnarled hands moving with a forgotten precision. The feel of the tools, a familiar comfort. He was no longer just a janitor. He was an engineer again, lost in the pure, clean logic of his craft. He was demonstrating the principle of harmonic dampening. He attached a small, battery-powered motor with an off-center weight to one end of the pipe, creating a steady, predictable vibration. When he turned it on, the pipe began to shake, and the weighted arm on the strut began to oscillate, its movement growing wider and more violent with each passing second, perfectly mimicking the resonance that was plaguing the Ares 7. It was a simple, elegant demonstration of the problem. Then, he stopped the motor and made a small adjustment. He added a second, smaller piece of metal to the strut, an asymmetrical brace, just as he had described to the young engineer. It looked wrong, unbalanced, a violation of the clean, symmetrical design the NASA engineers prized. He turned the motor back on. The pipe began to shake as before. But this time, something different happened. The asymmetrical brace disrupted the harmonic feedback loop. It created a counter-resonance, a tiny opposing vibration that canceled out the primary one. The violent oscillation of the weighted arm ceased, replaced by a steady, stable hum. The model sat there, quietly humming on the workbench, the vibration contained, the problem solved. It was a ridiculously low-tech solution to a multi-billion-dollar problem, an answer so simple it was almost insulting. Leo looked at his creation, a wave of profound satisfaction washing over him. He had made his theory tangible. He had built the truth. Now, all he had to do was find someone who was willing to see it. The junior engineer, David, couldn't shake the old janitor's words from his mind. "You're looking at the math, but you're not listening to the music." The phrase had burrowed into his thoughts. An annoying, persistent earworm. After the catastrophic failure of the ground test, David had felt a growing sense of unease. Their approach wasn't working. They were trapped in a loop of their own assumptions, blinded by the complexity of their models. He started to wonder, what if the old man wasn't crazy? What if his strange analogy about music was just a different way of describing a phenomenon they were all missing? Driven by a nagging curiosity he couldn't explain, David decided to do something he knew he wasn't supposed to. He accessed the personnel files, pulling up the record for one Leopold Vasile. The file was sparse. It listed his age, his start date, his address, and his previous employment. A string of menial jobs since his arrival in the United States as a political refugee over 30 years ago. There was no mention of education, no hint of any other life. It was a dead end. But then, David had another idea. He searched for Leo's name not in their internal systems, but on the deep web, using academic search engines that could access archived international university records. He typed Leopold Vasile and mechanical engineering. For a few moments, there was nothing. Then, a single archived result popped up from a university that had been dissolved in 1989. It was a digitized copy of a scientific journal. On the third page was an article titled Principles of Asymmetrical Dampening in High-Stress Fluid Dynamics. The author was Professor Leopold Vasile. David's blood ran cold. He quickly downloaded the paper and began to read. It was dense, highly technical, and utterly brilliant. The paper described, in painstaking detail, the exact phenomenon they were witnessing in the Ares 7. It theorized that under certain conditions, a perfectly symmetrical design could create a catastrophic resonant feedback loop. And it proposed a solution. The introduction of a deliberate, calculated asymmetry to disrupt the harmonic wave. David stared at the screen, his mind reeling. The answer, their salvation, had been published 35 years ago by the man who cleaned their offices. The man they had laughed at. He printed the article, his hands shaking, and ran out of his office, his heart pounding with a mixture of shame, awe, and a desperate, surging hope. David found Dr. Thorne in his office, staring blankly at a wall of schematics, a man who looked utterly defeated. "Dr. Thorne," David said, his voice breathless from his run across the facility. "You need to see this." Thorne didn't even turn around. "If it's another simulation log, I don't want to see it. I'm done." "It's not a simulation," David insisted, stepping forward and placing the printed academic paper on Thorne's desk. "It's this. And you need to come with me. Now." Thorne glanced down at the paper, his eyes scanning the title and the author's name. He saw the arcane mathematics, the complex diagrams. He looked back at David, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. "What is this?" "It's the answer," David said, his voice filled with a conviction that finally broke through Thorne's apathy. "Just, please, come with me." Intrigued despite himself, Thorne followed David through the labyrinthine corridors of the facility, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the late hour. They arrived at the dusty, forgotten workshop, a place Thorne hadn't set foot in for years. In the center of the room, on a cluttered workbench, a small, crude model made of scrap metal was humming quietly, powered by a small battery. Standing beside it, a figure in a gray janitor's uniform, was Leo. Thorne stopped dead in his tracks, a wave of disbelief washing over him. He looked from the academic paper in his hand to the old man by the workbench, and then to the ridiculously simple model that was a perfect, physical demonstration of the very principles laid out in the 35-year-old document. Leo turned off the motor, and the humming stopped. The silence in the room was absolute. He looked at Thorne, not with triumph or resentment, but with the calm, steady gaze of a teacher waiting for his student to finally understand the lesson. "Professor Vasile?" Thorne whispered, the name feeling foreign and unbelievable on his tongue. Leo simply nodded. In that moment, the world shifted for Aris Thorne. The janitor disappeared, and in his place stood a giant, a man whose intellect had been hidden in plain sight. The shame was a cold, heavy stone in his stomach. He had not just been wrong, he had been a fool, blinded by an arrogance so profound it had almost led them to ruin. Aris Thorne stood before the crude model, his mind struggling to reconcile the two realities it was being presented with. On one hand, there was the janitor, the invisible, low-skilled worker he had callously dismissed. On the other, there was Professor Leopold Vasile, the author of a paper so advanced, so prescient, that it felt like it had been written specifically for the crisis they were now facing. He picked up the model, his hands, which had overseen the construction of the most complex machine on Earth, now holding a simple contraption of scrap metal. He felt the weight of it, the simple, undeniable truth it represented. He ran his fingers over the asymmetrical brace, the small, ugly piece of metal that violated every aesthetic and design principle his team held dear, yet was the key to everything. He looked at Leo, truly looked at him for the first time, and saw not an old man in a janitor's uniform, but a quiet colossus of intellect, his eyes holding a depth of knowledge and a weariness that spoke of a life Thorne could barely imagine. The apologies began to form in his throat, a torrent of words about his arrogance, his blindness, his profound regret. But they all felt small and inadequate in the face of this revelation. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. "How?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How did you know?" Leo looked from Thorne's face to the gleaming white tip of the Ares 7, visible through the workshop's grimy window. "You build the rocket to be perfect, symmetrical, a work of art," Leo began, his voice soft, a slight melodic accent coloring his words. "But the universe is not perfect. It is full of chaos, of asymmetry. The fuel, it does not flow in a perfect line. It pulses, like a heart. It creates a rhythm. Your engineers, they see the pipe as a static object. They trust the math. But I learned to listen to the rhythm. I learned to listen to the music." He tapped the asymmetrical brace on the model. "This piece, it is ugly. It does not belong in your perfect equation. But it teaches the rocket a new song. It breaks the rhythm of the vibration and creates a new one. A safe one. It introduces a small, controlled piece of chaos to fight the larger, uncontrolled chaos." Thorne stared, mesmerized. Leo wasn't just talking about engineering. He was talking about a philosophy, a way of seeing the world that was so profoundly different from his own. He had been trying to impose order on the universe, while Leo understood that sometimes you had to embrace its inherent imperfection. The implementation of the solution was swift and almost surreal. Dr. Thorne, humbled and re-energized, convened an emergency meeting with his senior team. He didn't just present the solution, he presented the man who had found it. He walked into the main conference room with Leo at his side, and before he showed them the model or the academic paper, he told them the story of Professor Leopold Vasile. The room was filled with a stunned, heavy silence as the engineers, the same men and women who had shared a cruel laugh at Leo's expense, were confronted with the reality of who he was. Shame was a palpable force in the room, a collective, silent admission of their own hubris. Leo, uncomfortable with the sudden attention, stood quietly, his hands clasped behind his back, looking more like a guest at a funeral than a celebrated genius. Thorne then unveiled the model and explained the principle of the asymmetrical dampener. There was some initial skepticism, not of the science, which was unassailable, but of its sheer simplicity. It felt too easy, too low-tech, a solution born of a forgotten era. Yet, when they ran the new simulations, incorporating the small, ugly brace into the design of the fuel conduit strut, the results were staggering. The vibration vanished, not just dampened, but gone entirely. The cascading red lines on the diagnostic screens were replaced by a steady, solid wall of green. It worked perfectly, every single time. A wave of relief so profound it was almost dizzying washed over the team. The tension that had choked the facility for weeks finally broke, replaced by a frantic, focused energy. Machinists were called in overnight to fabricate the new brace from a specialized titanium alloy. The best technicians, working with a reverence usually reserved for the rocket's delicate payload, were tasked with installing it. Thorne personally supervised the entire operation, but he refused to make a single decision without first consulting Leo, who stood beside him. A quiet, guiding presence in his simple gray uniform, occasionally pointing with a gnarled finger and offering a soft-spoken suggestion that invariably proved to be correct. The man they had dismissed as a cleaner was now the most important person in the room, the quiet maestro conducting their symphony of redemption. The day of the launch arrived. A picture-perfect morning with a sky of brilliant, cloudless blue. The atmosphere at the NASA facility was electric. A potent cocktail of extreme tension and fragile hope. The entire world was watching. The catastrophic ground test had been explained away as a minor sensor malfunction. But whispers of a deeper problem had leaked, and the mission's credibility hung by a thread. In the control room, every station was manned, every screen glowing with streams of data. Dr. Aris Thorne stood at the center of it all, but he was not alone. He had insisted that a chair be brought for Leo, placing it right beside the mission commander's console. An unprecedented honor. Leo had initially refused, protesting that he was just a janitor and had no place there. But Thorne had been firm. "Your place is right here, Professor," he had said, his voice full of a respect that was now absolute. And so, Leo sat there, wearing his freshly laundered work uniform. A strange, humble island in a sea of official flight suits and headsets. The final countdown began, the familiar, measured voice echoing through the control room and across the globe. 10, 9. The massive engines began to ignite, sending a deep, primordial roar across the landscape. 8, 7. The ground began to tremble, a controlled earthquake of immense power. Leo closed his eyes for a moment, not looking at the monitors, but feeling the vibration through the floor, through the very bones of the building. He was listening. 6, 5. The tremors grew, and a knot of fear tightened in the stomachs of every engineer in the room. This was the moment of truth. 4, 3. The clamps holding the colossal rocket to the Earth released with an explosive crack. 2, 1. Ignition. The Ares 7 rose from the launchpad, at first with a majestic slowness, and then with a surge of astonishing speed. A brilliant white spear climbing on a pillar of controlled fire. The control room held its collective breath. All eyes were on the telemetry data streaming in from the primary fuel conduit. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, the call came from the systems analyst, his voice cracking with emotion. "Vibration levels are nominal. The dampener is working. I repeat, all systems are green, the bird is flying true." A tidal wave of cheers and applause erupted in the control room, a raw, explosive release of weeks of pent-up fear and anxiety. Engineers hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces, their professionalism momentarily forgotten in a shared moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. The Ares 7 was performing flawlessly, soaring through the upper atmosphere with a grace and power that exceeded all expectations. Aris Thorne didn't join in the celebration. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the main view screen, watching the rocket shrink into a brilliant, ascending star against the blackness of space. He felt a profound sense of gratitude that was so overwhelming it almost brought him to his knees. He turned to Leo, who was watching the screen with a small, quiet smile on his face. The roar of the room seemed to fade into the background as Thorne extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Professor, thank you." Leo took his hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "You built a magnificent machine, Doctor," Leo replied, his gaze still fixed on the disappearing rocket. "It just needed to learn how to sing the right song." Later that day, after the press conferences and the champagne toasts, Thorne found Leo in the empty workshop, packing his few tools into a small, worn-out canvas bag. "What are you doing?" Aris asked, a sense of panic in his voice. "My shift is over," Leo said simply. "The floors need to be cleaned." Thorne shook his head. "No. Your life as a janitor is over, Leo. I want to offer you a position, a permanent one, as a senior consultant for propulsion dynamics. We'll match the salary of your professorship, adjusted for inflation, of course. We need you here." Leo paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. He looked around the dusty workshop, then through the window at the now empty launchpad, a silent, concrete monument to the day's victory. He seemed to be weighing a decision of immense personal significance. The news of the janitor who saved the Ares 7 mission became a quiet legend within the walls of NASA. It was never released to the press. The potential embarrassment was too great, and the story itself felt too sacred for the glare of the public eye. It became an internal parable, a whispered reminder of the day that brilliance was found in the most unexpected of places. Dr. Aris Thorne was a changed man. The hard shell of his intellectual arrogance had been shattered, replaced by a newfound humility and an open-mindedness that made him a better leader and a better scientist. He championed a new initiative at the agency, a program designed to solicit innovative ideas from employees at every level, from the cafeteria workers to the security guards, ensuring that a voice like Leo's would never again be silenced by prejudice or pride. And as for Professor Leopold Vasile, he did not accept the prestigious, high-paying position he was offered. He politely declined the title, the office, and the salary. He agreed, however, to be an occasional consultant, coming in a few days a week to wander the labs, to look over the shoulders of young engineers, and to listen to the music of their new machines. He still wore his simple gray uniform, claiming it was comfortable and that he didn't want any special treatment. He continued to live in his small, book-filled apartment, finding more comfort in the company of his old texts than in the accolades of a world he had long since detached from. Sometimes, late at night, when the facility was quiet, the engineers would see him, not with a mop and bucket, but with a set of schematics, his brow furrowed in concentration, offering a quiet word of advice that would unlock a stubborn problem. He had found a unique balance, a way to be both the humble janitor and the brilliant professor, a ghost in the machine who was no longer invisible, but had become its quiet, unassuming guardian angel, a living testament to the truth that knowledge has no rank, and wisdom wears no uniform. Leo's story rippled through the institution in profound ways. The young engineer, David, who had been the first to listen, found his own career on a fast track. Thorne had seen in him not just a bright engineer, but someone with the intellectual courage to question his own assumptions and the humility to look for answers beyond the confines of a job title. David became a key figure in Thorne's new cross-departmental innovation team, often sharing the story of Professor Vasile as a cautionary tale against the dangers of intellectual pride. The culture of the entire facility began to shift, slowly but surely. The rigid hierarchy that had once defined their interactions began to soften. Engineers started talking to technicians more, listening to the insights of the people who physically built the components they designed. They learned that practical, hands-on experience often held wisdom that could not be found in a textbook or a computer simulation. The change was most evident in the little things. A senior scientist might be seen having lunch with a machinist from the workshop. A department head might stop a maintenance worker in the hall to ask about a strange noise in the ventilation system, listening to the answer with genuine interest. They were all learning to listen to the music of the entire facility, not just the isolated notes of their own departments. Leo himself seemed to draw a quiet strength from his new role. The deep-seated sadness that had always lingered in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a twinkle of purpose. He had spent 30 years believing that the most valuable part of himself was lost forever. Now, he understood that knowledge, true knowledge, could never be lost. It could only lie dormant, waiting for the right moment, the right problem, to be reawakened. He was teaching again, not in a grand lecture hall, but in quiet, one-on-one conversations over a shared workbench or a complex diagram. He taught the young engineers not just about resonance and fluid dynamics, but about the importance of observation, of humility, and of seeing the world as an interconnected system. One afternoon, months after the successful launch of the Ares 7, Thorne found Leo sitting on a bench outside, watching as a new rocket component was being carefully transported to the assembly building. The setting sun cast a warm, golden light on the old man's face, and he seemed, in that moment, completely at peace. Thorne sat down beside him, and for a while, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the slow, careful work of the engineers and technicians, a silent ballet of science and labor. "We're naming the new deep space probe after you," Thorne said quietly, breaking the silence. "The Vassal Explorer. It's going to study stellar harmonics, the vibrations of distant stars." It seemed appropriate. Leo turned to look at him, a rare, wide smile spreading across his face. It was a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that made him look like the young, hopeful professor in the old photograph. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. The gratitude between them was a deep, unspoken understanding. "Stellar harmonics," Leo mused, his gaze turning towards the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. "The music of the spheres. I would like that very much." He had spent a lifetime listening to the hidden rhythms of the world, from the complex vibrations in a machine built to touch the heavens, to the simple, steady beat of his own quiet existence. He had lost a world, but in the end, he had helped two different worlds connect. The one of meticulous, brilliant engineering, and the one of humble, profound wisdom. He had reminded them all that the path to the stars is not just paved with equations and ambition, but with the courage to listen to the quietest voices, for it is often there, in the most unexpected of places, that the truest music of the universe can be heard. He had saved the mission, but he had also saved them from themselves, a lesson that was far more valuable than any single rocket launch. The legacy of Professor Vasile became woven into the very fabric of the institution. A modern-day fairy tale that served as both an inspiration and a warning. New recruits were told the story on their first day, not to embarrass the senior staff who had been part of it, but to instill in them a core principle. Every mind has value. The workshop where Leo had built his simple model was preserved. The crude device now encased in glass like a holy relic, a permanent installation next to the gleaming, high-tech displays of rocket engines and spacesuits. It was a stark, powerful visual reminder that the most elegant solutions are often the simplest, and that a great idea can come from anywhere, crafted from scrap metal in a dusty room just as easily as it can from a supercomputer in a sterile lab. Aris Thorne went on to lead the agency to some of its greatest triumphs. But he always measured his success not by the number of successful launches, but by the health of the culture he had helped to build. He never again allowed himself or his team to be blinded by the prestige of a degree or the authority of a title. He sought out dissenting opinions, he encouraged radical ideas, and he made it a point to walk the entire facility every single day, talking to everyone, always listening, always searching for the next Professor Vasile who might be hiding in plain sight. Leo continued his quiet consultancy for several more years, becoming a beloved, almost mythical figure to a new generation of scientists and engineers. They would seek him out for his wisdom not only on matters of engineering, but on life itself. He taught them that failure was not an end, but an opportunity to learn, and that humility was the true cornerstone of genius. When he finally retired for good, his small, book-filled apartment was preserved as a historical landmark by the agency, its contents a library of wisdom for future generations. His story served as a timeless and powerful lesson for all of humanity in its quest for the stars. That to reach for the heavens, we must first have the wisdom to look for the genius that stands quietly among us on the ground, waiting patiently to be heard.